And actually the first talk will be surviving survivorship bias, presented by Professor Francesco Corielli from University. So as we have already a delay, I leave the floor to Professor Corielli.
Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. This is not really to talk about survivorship bias for the off-topic 15 years ago. I try to use the survivorship bias analysis to give an example of a very important problem in financial data. It is obvious for a statistician is the first thing the statistician thinks. That is data from finance that do not come from samples, do not come from experiments, they come from observation. So they are similar to data for astronomers or for epidemiologists and so on. And so you must be very, very careful using statistics because the standard, say 101 statistics typically used in economics is statistics which is proper when you have sampling data, when you have experiments, but when you don't have experiments, you need to be very careful. This is becoming something understood, but still is not so much understood, also because it's much more difficult, and typically results are less clear-cut, so it's more difficult to publish that. So it's not very popular as an argument. Let's start. So, this we already did say, financial data do not come from random sampling. And they are similar to data in other observational sciences. When data do not come from sampling, the point is that I cannot say that I observe the population. I observe the population through some kind of filter that allows me to observe the data. And so it is not possible for me just to model the population and then I have my sample. I must also model the way I get my data. Because this is going to change my info. I typically, when I introduce this to my students, I give this very simple example. If you read on the newspaper that I am alive, you have some information which is completely different to the information I get if I read on the newspaper that I am alive. Okay, this. If you think about this kind of example a little bit, you are going to get a gist of what is the idea of not having, say, sampling data. Thus, survivorship bias in this talk is an example. I have a paper, this is the first time here in this meeting I present something I did in an academic paper. I have a paper which only deals with this topic, and if anyone is interested, I can give the paper, but here is just an example. So, basically, just some story. Modern finance, say, modern academic, scientific finance, was in some sense born from the attempt of measuring the effective ability of fund managers. This was the first problem. Towles asked himself this when he began to study data, and he collected a number of, say, what could have become econometricians in the late 20s, and created Econometrica and created a group of people who made modern economics, modern empirical economics. The question was, is it possible to see whether I am able to choose investor or I am able to choose securities and so on? And most of what was done in classical finance was this. For instance, the development of market models, which began at the beginning of the 60s, was considered as the building of a benchmark which compare performances. You cannot simply look at performances, you must, say, correct in some sense for risk. This idea is the basic idea of market model. And each single new step in the development of finance carries some weight. The question, can you do better than the market, or something like this? So the question, how to measure performance in the right way is one of the questions of finance. At the beginning, and if you read the paper by Sharp in the 60s, this is very clear. At the beginning, data was very poor, meaning you had lots of markets, lots of funds, lots of data, but not really very well, readily available, and so you have to wait some time. Today we have many databases, and the most used academic databases for fund performance is the CRSP. Once it was called the CRSP tape, because we go back to the 80s, but now it's the CRSP Mutual Fund Database, which was born in the 90s, but if you really study the CRSP, you understand that you can use it starting from 2000, not before. It tries to contain everything which did exist, basically, at least in the USA industry of fund management. However, it is strange that while we have tools for dealing, obviously CSP is not a sample. CSP is what exists, is what did exist, is the story of the field, contains everything, with any kind of distortion or peculiarity you have in this data. Now the question is how to analyze data in this kind of data set, which is the observation of the universe. Well, it's strange that while the statistical tools for dealing with non-sampling data exist since the beginning of statistics, because survivorship analysis is a classical problem in statistics, in medical statistics, for instance, this was basically this point, this important point, was almost completely forgotten, at least in the empirical finance field, at least up to 1989. The first rumble, the first, say, not still cried out criticism was from 1989. And then between 1989 and 1995, a lot of now very famous papers were published about just one problem connected with this kind of, say, non-sampling data, the problem of survivorship bias. I try to summarize the paradigm which was born with this paper. Now, basically, everybody believes in this. Actually, in the recent past, there is some kind of, say, second-order criticism to this paradigm. Now, let's see the paradigm. The paradigm is this. Backward reconstructing fund databases starting from funds which exist today excludes dead funds. This is obvious. If I use a database which contains funds because they are live today, okay, I forget all the funds which simply close during time. And this is obvious. 2. If the probability of fund demise is higher and fund performance is lower, the simple average of returns from survival fund shall overestimate the a priori expected value of return, because I have just the winners in some sense. Okay? Remember, the first part of the sentence is very important. If fund demise probability is higher where fund performance is low, this is something which should be checked. Number 3, you should, in order to avoid, and here we arrive to the critical point, to avoid this, you should reveal the database including all funds that did exist, not just the survivor one. And this is what CRSP did, basically, at least starting from 2000. The data are very incomplete before 2000. And then the last sentence, which was the statement in these papers, and this we are going to see is wrong, but it's not so strange, it is wrong. It is, for a statistician, it's obvious it's wrong, but obviously this is not so in another field. The problem is solved if we estimate the expected value of returns using data on both existing and dead fund. Just look at the mean, let's say we use the mean, no, we are not using the mean, let's say we use the mean of all the data. So you have the bad funds, the dead funds and the survival funds, and this corrects the problems, avoids survivorship bias. Okay, now this seems to be all very intuitive. In fact, when it was brought forward, the reaction was, why did I not think about this before? And actually you should have, because this is a standard problem in statistics. But we must qualify these steps. Point 1 is obvious. If you only use survivor, say, if you only observe people who is still taking their medicine because they are alive, obviously you are going to overvalue the quality of the medicine simply because they never die when they are still taking the medicine. If you read on the newspaper you are alive, it's not a very big information. The second point is an empirical thesis, which should be checked. I know of just one paper about this, is very recent, about, let's say, there are many papers, but one paper which uses the full data set. And the question is it true that hedge funds die because they have a poor performance? Number 3, point 3, is enticing, but the question is that it is impossible to satisfy. Remember, point 3 was you must rebuild the database including all existing funds. What you can do is put all the existing funds up to the time they die, but you cannot revive. And this is the main point of this talk. The difference between a full sample, that is, you revive that fund and see what would have happened had they been alive, and instead, what you can do, you include them up to the time of demise, which is not a full sample, as we are going to see in a moment. Point 4 is simply wrong. Due to point 3, point 4 is wrong. If you compute the mean of the, say, pseudo full sample, that is with dead funds, but not dead funds, let's say, living again, you're going to have a bias in the estimate of the expected return. And this is, so I am not inventing this, it's something very standard, that is strange that was forgotten at the time, yes, also today. Now, for a statistician, it's very strange to hear somewhere in a scientific field the idea that in this setting where you have people alive at some point, people in this case funds, and then they die, and this fact of being living or dying is correlated with what you are observing, and you can simply solve the problem by observing all patients, say, all subjects of the medical survey, in this case all funds. It's very strange to have this idea that doing this and taking the mean is enough, because this would tell you that the whole field of survival analysis is basically useless. You don't use it because you have solved the problem by observing everyone in the study. And so it's strange, it's not something obvious for a statistician. Anyway, let's try to again stress the point, we can never complete the sample. A real complete sample would be a sample where dead funds still exist and give a performance. Okay? The question is, if we don't have the data on dead funds after they died, we cannot know what would have been their performance, beginning from that date up to now. And suppose, just as an instance, that it is true that you are going away, you are going to die because you have a bad performance. Okay, what you have is that each fund which goes away in a bad day. So typically you are undervaluing the performance which this fund could give you, because simply you are stopping it when things go wrong. Maybe if you wait, things will have gone better. Maybe not, but this is the point. Let's go on. We do now a very simple example. This is a very simple version of this supposed fund demise process. Suppose you have all funds, and all funds are the same, are the same statistical properties. Suppose all returns are independent, all Gaussian, all with the same expected value and variance. So there is no difference across funds. So basically, any fund is a sample of the full population, gives you the same information. So very simple. Now, suppose you may observe the performance in two periods. First, you observe the performance in the first period, and then you observe in a second period, but do not always record both of these two data. We suppose three possible data collection procedures. The first is the real full sample. The full sample is all data are observed for all funds on both periods. This is the true sample. You observe everything which happens. Second, collection of data. Data are observed only for funds which survive the first return. So for this you observe the second return, and then we're going to see we take the mean, but this is just for the sample. So this kind of sampling is what we criticize when we speak of survivorship bias, because we do not even recall that funds existed which did not satisfy the rule in the first return. Number 3, data collection, you observe data for all funds, but for the dead funds, you recall the first return, the first random variable, but you do not observe the second because they are dead. This is what in the survivorship bias literature is called the full sample. And you see it's not the full sample. The full sample is the first, not this one. This does not contain all the possible second times of these funds. Now, let's formalize this. Suppose you have these two index random variable, which is a Gaussian with some expected value 2 is not important, and there is standard deviation of 1, again, is not important. You want to make inference on the expected value, the same for all. They are all independent, there is no problem there. Observation comes in three possible ways. You observe xi, the ith fund, say, at time 1, and then independently at time 2, and then you record the mean, the error. You may have any independent copies of this. This is called the full sample. This is the real full sample. You have everything. There is no selection in this sample. The second possibility, you observe the first return, and if this is greater than some level, then you go and you observe independently a second return, and then you record the mean. Otherwise, you simply delete the first of you forget you ever did observe the first time the process. This is what we call the truncated sample, and this is what is the, say, the criticized survivorship bias sample. And then is the, say, complete sample. We call that kind of sample in statistics is called a truncated sample. Now there is a censored sample, which is the pseudo full sample in survivorship bias literature. You observe the first x. If this is greater than k, then you go on and you observe independently and second x, and then you get the mean. Otherwise, you simply have the first observation. This is the, let's say, full sample of the survivorship bias literature. Now, suppose we use the mean of the data, as suggested in this literature, in order to estimate q, which is the expected value of the return. In the full sample, obviously, the mean gives me an expected value of q, so it is an unbiased estimate. If the sample is the truncated sample, it is only those funds who at the first time get a return greater than k, and so you have a second time, you have a bias, and this bias is always positive. Small phi and big phi are just the density and the cumulative distribution of a Gaussian, so the ratio is surely positive, so the bias is surely positive. You overstate the expected value, and this is exactly what the literature on survivorship bias tells you. But now, let's see what happens if you do what the literature on survivorship bias tells you to do in order to avoid the bias. You complete the sample with the first period for those who do not have the second period. In that case, the mean of the data is biased, but it's biased negatively. Because basically you have lots of funds which when basically they could not, suppose you have this fund, by chance he has a first, all these funds are the same, so basically they give you the same information. So the fact that a sample, a fund exists at the second time period is just chance. It's just random. Okay? So what happens is simply this, you flip the first coin, goes not good for you, and then you go out with a bad result. So you have a bad result and you go out. You do not have the chance to, say, to try a second time, maybe you have got something more near the end. So this is you have a negative bias. So the supposedly corrected sample gives me a negative bias. In the same way as the censored sample, the truncated sample gives me a positive bias. Now, the point is very important because here the statistical point becomes relevant. As you see, the shape of the bias depends on the model. I say things are Gaussian, and you see that the density, the Gaussian density, appears in the bias. This means that when I have this kind of problems, I cannot solve them by saying, okay, I use all the data, because the model, I suppose, for the data changes the amount of bias. So the model is going to be very important. The model of how I select data, for instance, the choice of k, is very important. Also the distribution is very important to correct the bias. You cannot simply take, say, complete the database and then take the mean, because in order to solve the problem, we need to have a model of how the selection is made. And this is the whole idea of survivorship analysis in statistics. This is just an example with numbers, not important. Now, these obviously are just metaphors of what we do, observe or not in performance databases. The full sample is unobservable, we cannot revive dead funds, but this would be the only setting where we don't need a model for the selection, because we do not have the selection, so we can simply take the mean and we have a good estimate. In all the other cases, we need to correct the estimate, so we need the model. We can correct the estimate, but we need the model to correct the estimate. We cannot simply say, okay, I solved the problem because now I have all the data, because it's not the full data. Okay, that's it. Remember, this is very important. The bias depends both on the population model, the Gaussian, and on the sampling model. This is what I told you at the beginning of the talk. The sampling model, how you get data is important when you do not have a simple, a standard simple random sample or an experiment, things like this. It's very important to model. This typically you don't do, or do it in a very naive way, say, random sampling data. Go. The practical consequences are first that the negative difference between expected return estimated truncated survival and the censored full sample in the survivorship literature, and we observe this negative difference is not a measure of survivorship bias, but is the sum of two biases, one which is positive and one which is negative. Second, there is no way of estimating the survivorship bias and then the Q, the mean respective value, without modeling the survivorship process. And this is very important. We need a model of this process. Now, point 2 becomes now important because point 2 is, in some sense, the implicit assumption on the model of selection. Randomized probability is negatively correlated with final performance. Is this true? More in general, which model would you use for survival? There is no standard model in the literature. Everybody is measuring performances, but there is no survival model. And so we could argue that measures of performance are not very good. I worked on this with a student of mine in the last years, and we consider the full CRSP dataset. Full CRSP dataset is a big mess, because it's very difficult to use, contains lots of things which must be filtered out and so on, but for the first time I think it was a complete, not just say 1,000 funds because are of this kind, or all the funds. And basically all the funds invested in stocks, so roughly 30,000 funds. Just to see what this, if there is some reason in the madness of dying because of performance. And we have a date paper on this, so I am not going to summarize it. I'm just going to give you an example. In fact, if you analyze just very simple way that even with the graph, you see that performance may be an element, a reason for demise, but it's not. Surely not the only reason. So you need something more in that model. I show you 3 graphs. These are from data which we can really use in the CRSP when it is really probably complete as a data set between 2000 and 2011, because this was done 1 year ago. And basically, we are going to compute the so-called survivorship bias at each date in this time using returns which are for 1 year, and we take into account all funds which survive for all the time period, so survivors, and all funds which somewhere before or later during the period die. So we split the population in these two subpopulations, and we compare the results. This is the first very simple result. The stressed blue line is the difference between the returns of those funds who survived for all the 11 years and the total of the population of funds which existed during this time, which basically existed at that time where the mean return was computed. And this should be the estimate of the survivorship bias in the standard literature. The other one, the other line, which shows you, as you see, is bigger, always higher than the other. Remember, you are summing two bias, okay, and so you are getting a bigger bias. In fact, you observe this. This is the difference between surviving and non-surviving. And now, an interesting point. It seems, if you just look at this, you see that the difference is big just at the beginning. At the beginning, we are comparing funds which you know, are going to survive for all the time period, and funds which exist at the beginning and surely do not exist at the end. So it's clear that the difference at the beginning is going to be bigger. But if you go on for 5-6 years, the difference becomes almost nil, less than 1%. okay? Which is less than what you can say it is different than 0 if you do a very simple test. Then let's do another thing. If performance is the reason or the main reason for survivorship or not, it should be that funds which survive should have performance which are higher than funds which do not survive. So let's just count the number of funds which did survive for all 11 years, which give you a performance which is lower than the mean performance of not survived funds. And you get this. You see at the beginning you have few funds, so the number is more, but you already have 2,000 or less. In 2003 you arrived at 2,000 funds which did survive for 11 years, but they have a performance which is not less than some fund which died, it's less than the average of the funds which died. And if you compute the ratio between the number of funds which underperform the mean of the dead one in the population of the living one at the end, and the number of dead funds, you see something which is clear. If you arrive to 2006, this ratio becomes 1 and then becomes big. So surely there is some connection between performance and survival, but it's not so strong as it is assumed in the standard ratio. That's it, basically. Conclusions. This is just an example that if you have data which do not come from simple random sampling, do not come from experiment, there is no sample behind it, but just observation, you must be very careful in how you use statistics. You cannot believe you can simply play a little bit with data and you solve the problem. The problem is bigger than this. So it is impossible in general to estimate the parameters of the population if you don't specify the sampling model, the Gaussian in this case, the K, and so on. This is obvious from the statistical point of view, and I try to illustrate this with a classical setting of survivorship bias. This survivorship bias, as discussed in the literature, has been shown to be not an estimate of the effect of sample quantitation, but the sum of two biases. The exact quantification of such biases, and this is important, I did not quantify it. I did a measure based on the data, but I did not use a survival model. The next step is to build a survival model to know what is the real bias. Okay? The exact quantification of such biases depends on both the specification of the population and the survivorship model. It may be that it is connected with performance, but this connection is not as strong as hypothesized by the standard survivorship paradigm. Financial data come to us almost always at conditions. In this condition, qualified information in the data. If you build the likelihood of the data, you must know the condition under which you get the data. The use of a random sampling paradigm, or the idea that you can manipulate the data so that you can reduce yourself to the simple random sampling paradigm may imply considerable estimation errors, and that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions in the audience? If not, I have just an observation actually. Because, first of all, I feel extremely sensitive to the problem which has been raised by Professor Corielli, because working in fund management, we have people selecting hedge funds from databases. And so obviously they will start to select people which are still alive today, more often preferred guys which had the time returning in the recent past, and will perform all the others until they have built a track or a synthetic track of the portfolio of potential guys which have been selected. And this is the bad way to proceed actually, because you always have stellar tracks with no volatility and absolutely nice things. And what is important is trying to understand how to try to correct those results. Professor Corielli gives a way for that. So another thing that you say that performances and survival is eventually potentially linked to performances, but not only about performances. For instance, in hedge funds, when a fund has a very good performances, it will attract funds, it will start to close, it will not need any more to be on a platform or to report or whatever, and it will disappear with the other bias, just because it has two nice performances.
We have in the paper there is a survival model which we try to just refusing what is valuable in the CRSP data set. And two main reasons for that are flows and obviously expenses. Expenses are is much more correlated with the debt of a fund than before. So the expense ratio is much more important. And also the flows. The problem with CRSP is that also the age of the company which creates the fund is very important, and the number of funds created by the company, because there are companies who don't create and destroy funds, and other companies do not do this. So there are lots of things to keep in mind when we do this kind of analysis. And for the moment, just we try to explore the data, so to see if there is correlation between survival and a real survival model is something more difficult. But the point I want to make, which is basically is not my point, is a standard statistical point. You must model survival if you have a survival center. Otherwise, you cannot. If you are an epidemiologist and you study the consequences of some kind of medicine or therapy or things, and you cannot keep into account the fact that your patients are coming back or not coming back, and the reason why they come and not come back, simply you are not going to do a good estimate. This is obviously completely clear for epidemiology. It's strange that for the moment it's not the same in finance. I think it's going to be in the next few years. Thank you.
Maybe just to conclude that the field in finance where epidemiologists and people working with finance topics work together in insurances, so maybe we need an actuary for that.
Well, you are a physicist, and for instance, you know that the fact that they are continuing finding planets which are very big is not because only planet big exist, but only big can be seen for the moment.
So let's thank again Professor Corielli. And we're going to move forward